Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Transparency, How It is Reshaping the Textile Value Chain. Today's presentation will be recorded and sent out to all registered participants and also be posted on the Hub. We will have a Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. You can type your questions into the question box on the webinar doc. Any unanswered questions will be answered afterward via email. Now on to Yvonne Tan, Director of Data Management and China Strategy for Textile Exchange. Yvonne?
Hello, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us on this three-part series of digital innovations in traceability. Last month, we spoke a little bit about blockchain myths and versus relevance for the textile industry. And today we continue the second part webinar on transparency, how it is reshaping the textile value chain. So this is session will be broken into three parts. I have Amit introducing creating transparent supply chains, and then I will follow on with the role of sustainability standards, and lastly we will have a Q&A session to answer all your questions and clarifications. So a little bit of an introduction to myself. I am Yvonne Tan. I'm based in Malaysia. I've been with Textile Exchange for about 10 years now. My background is largely in data transformation and system implementation. And I head up the data management and China strategy in Textile Exchange. So I'm going to hand over the floor to Amit Gautam, and he can have a little introduction of himself.
Thanks, Yvonne. So welcome everyone again back to our part 2 of the joint with Textile Exchange, the webinar series. Very briefly about myself, I'm Amit Gautam, CEO and founder of Textile Genesis. And prior to founding Textile Genesis about 2 years ago, I was working in the past with McKinsey, with Lensing and Booz Allen in various senior management roles. So essentially my background is combination of sustainability, technology, and apparel / fashion industry, and also spent about a year with World Economic Forum in Geneva for in sustainability around multiple sectors. So let's start. It's exciting to be again joining this this group and sharing our perspective on why transparency matters in the apparel supply chain. So if we move on, Yvonne would help me with the thanks. So before we start, I think it's very important to understand the difference between traceability, transparency, chain of custody, and what are used as forensic markers. And because it's quite an emerging field, there's quite a bit of confusion at times, what means what. And I think it's important to put that to rest before we move on with understanding what it means for the industry. So when you talk about traceability, it's essentially the ability to trace the history, the location of a product, essentially the flow of goods along the apparel and textile supply chain. Now, this definition of traceability comes from ISO 9001 and also used by GS1 standard in the traceability protocol. Now, the second concept that's used very broadly is transparency, which essentially means the ability to share the traceability data with the relevant players in your ecosystem, be it consumers, suppliers, employees, or investors. Now, what's important here to recognize is that transparency as an idea is practical for you as a brand or as a player only if you have a traceability backbone to relate to. If there's no traceability data, the question of transparency doesn't even come, or what needs to be shared in terms of with consumers to drive compelling storytelling, or what is compliance related data around traceability, which may not be relevant for consumers. So transparency is making that decision of what you want to share with the relevant players. Then the third concept that's used widely is the chain of custody, which essentially means the ability to trace the change in legal ownership of the product as it's transformed along the supply chain. Now, important thing here is that there's a lot of non-transformation events in the supply chain, like logistics, the trucking company involved, a rail freight or an air freight, which essentially are moving the goods from point A to point B, but are never legally owning the product and are neither involved in the transformation of the product. So chain of custody essentially focuses on the players which are actually involved in transforming an input material, a yarn, to a woven or knitted fabric, a gauge fabric to a finished fabric, or a fabric to a garment. And then the fourth concept that's used increasingly very common is around forensic markers, which essentially means the ability to physically verify the presence of a fiber or any other ingredient in a textile product at any stage along the supply chain. You can pick up a product and physically verify that that specific ingredient is in it or not. And fundamentally, on the forensic markers at the meta level, you have markers which are incorporated into the product, be it a DNA marker or a synthetic marker, or something which is inherent in the product, either the inherent, the micro level DNA sequencing of the product, or basically the naturally occurring minerals or isotopes in the product itself. So those are the fundamental, two meta level classification around markers, and Yvonne will go in much more actually practical aspect of how chain of custody and the markers work together. Now, having explained basically some of the core concepts around traceability and transparency, let me start with the second question now. What do you think is common between these brands? Now, unfortunately, I know you can't respond, but what we see here is brands which are common between mainstream large retailers. There are certain brands which are very strongly athletic wear oriented. Some of them are haute couture, and few are true leaders in sustainability, for example, Inefficient. So let me break the suspense and move on to the next slide. What's common between them is what we call traceability paradox, which is a key challenge in the supply chain. Essentially, what it means is, if we move on to the next one. So transparency paradox essentially refers to the aspect that majority of top 100 brands have announced 100% sustainable fibers target in the next 3 to 5 years. And these targets relate to cotton, relate to recycled polyester, to man-made cellulosic fibers, to linen, pretty much every single textile fiber that's used. So it's quite a commendable objective, a very strong vision and ambition from majority of top 100 apparel brands that we looked into. But if you ask the second question, what percentage of these brands can track their garment collections back to fiber origin? So Yvonne, if you, less than 5% of the top 100 brands can track their garment collections back to fiber origin. And that is the fundamental disconnect that we see in the market. Very strong ambition and vision to deliver on sustainable fibers target, but lack of systems, processes, and technology in place to deliver on that vision. And if you ask me, actually, even 5 is a big number. The number of brands that can track their entire garment collections back to fiber origin is quite close to 0. But it looks very bad when we say it's 0. So we always say it's less than 5, but actually there's no single brand who has the full visibility. And this paradox is essentially what we are trying to address, and I think several companies are trying to address through, a digital traceability using blockchain, using other advanced forensic marker verification, for example. Now, if we move on, traceability is challenging. What we saw on the previous page, right? Less than 5% of brands, top 100 being able to track. Then you ask your question, like, why is it so difficult? Why is it so difficult to get supply chain traceability in the chain? What we see, there are 4 main factors which makes traceability extremely challenging in the textile industry. First is the fragmentation of certification data. It's very fragmented. The supply chain itself is fragmented, and on top, you have fragmented data, and which is also variable over several organizations or different standards. So there's no consistency that you see. And that makes it very challenging, especially for large brands who have multiple standards they're tracking for different fibers to build a scale because of the lack of single source of truth. The second key challenge, Yvonne, what we see here is the inefficient manual processes. A lot of brands and supply chain partners, if you see, they have to manually track a lot of paper-based or PDF certificates along the supply chain, either at a product level, if it's a differentiated or a premium fiber, or if it's a standard, then again for the sustainable fibers. And what it does, it increases compliance cost because of a lot of back and forth communication that you see in the supply chain to have the compliance at the product level. The third reason why it's complex and difficult is very simply, it's quite profitable to counterfeit. So the supply chain players do not have an inherent incentive to drive transparency and traceability. Adulteration or contamination can increase margins sometimes by 20 to 30%. And therefore, when you try to do a traceability, within your company, and you see a lot of pushback from your supply chain, sometimes it might be a valid pushback because they have to do additional work. But at times, the pushback could also be because it directly impacts their ability to earn additional margin in some specific cases. And fourth, the reason it's extremely complex is because you do not have a user-friendly one or several technology platform and also a common language through which the data could be exchanged between different standards, or even the collaboration across the supply chain in terms of sharing traceability data. That's also quite difficult because some players are quite matured. They have matured ERP systems, and other players may not be that matured in terms of their ordering systems and their internal ERP systems. So essentially, then if we look into this specific aspect, and that's essentially the main reason why transparency is #1 priority for the procurement officers in the apparel and footwear industry. So this is a survey from McKinsey, end of 2019. They looked at brands who are collectively buying $100 billion worth of apparel and footwear goods. And the #1 priority that more than half of respondents said as in terms of their sourcing priority is sustainability and transparency. When I looked at the results, I was a bit surprised, to be honest, because I thought maybe, cross-functional collaboration or end-to-end process efficiency or even advanced analytics would be higher. But when you think again about this, then you realize that a lot of that work has already been done in the industry in the last 10 years. Whereas when it comes to, how do you ensure that you are actually receiving recycled polyester? Do you have the complete traceability across all the supply chain tiers so that the suppliers itself are compliant from across different standards? So the ability to source sustainable raw materials and have the underlying transparency is extremely new to the industry, but becoming very important because, as we discussed, of the commitments that the CEOs and boards have made of around achieving 100% sustainable fibers target or objective in the next 5 years, sometimes maybe in 10 years, but for some brands it's actually as quickly as 2 years. And then if we go further deeper into one specific example of how sustainability and transparency can very quickly shift the entire market. And here we are taking an example, a case study of viscose fibers. Thus just 3 years ago, Dirty Fashion Report was launched by Changing Markets Foundation in 2017, summer of 2017. And essentially they highlighted that the biggest challenge in this wood-based fiber, which is viscose, which is also one of the fastest growing fibers in the fashion industry, growing almost twice as fast as the overall market, that the biggest impact on environmental pollution, if production is not done properly, is in the manufacturing process itself. Because until this report came out, the majority of focus in man-made cellulosic fibers was around the wood, because these fibers are made from wood. So there are a lot of good standards like FSC, PEFC, and Canopy. But what is highlighted is the challenges in the production process itself, which was again kind of amplified, by Canopy, Textile Exchange, and ZDHC. And what it led to, Yvonne, then is the fact that several top brands made a public commitment to source sustainable and traceable viscose by 2023. So these are the 8 brands who are public signatories to the Changing Markets viscose roadmap. And I'm sure several more brands are on the way to actually sign up to that objective. Now, this has just happened in a matter of 2 to 3 years. And what it means, the big implication is what is happening in the industry is you're seeing the segmentation of the fibers market or the raw materials into sustainable and traceable fibers versus unsustainable and opaque. And we believe that it's not just limited to viscose. The same thing you start seeing happening in lyocell. The same thing will happen in recycled polyester, cotton, linen, name it. Every single fiber, wool, silk, every single fiber that's being used in the fashion textile industry, you will start seeing the market is getting very clearly segmented, whether it's sustainable and traceable versus unsustainable and opaque. And the difference in margin and premium will increase, and brands would very strongly focus on actually sourcing the former category, as what we have seen in the viscose market with very public commitments. And in this, so if you move on, Yvonne, it's not just about a defensive strategy, where you are trying to protect your risk and you're trying to be compliant, you're trying to make sure NGOs are not, breathing down your neck. I think there's a very, very strong positive element to transparency and sustainable supply chains as well. And this is where we see, the recent research from MIT in US, where they essentially did an extensive research, and the actual paper is actually on our website, so you could download it from our Textile Genesis website, the original paper. Essentially what it says is that brands are, consumers are willing to pay a premium to brands that can convince them that they have a transparent and sustainable supply chains. And the reason they are willing to do that is because of indirect reciprocity, what is called a psychological terms, indirect reciprocity, which means I'm willing to help you as a brand because I know you are willing to help someone else. And there's a very, very strong correlation of indirect reciprocity impact, why consumers are actually willing to reward brands if they're convinced that they are actually using part of that premium to further have sustainable and transparent supply chains. And direct reciprocity means I'm willing to help you because you're willing to help me. And in this case, indirect means you're helping a brand. As a consumer, I'm willing to pay your premium because I know you're going to support your supply chain. And on a similar note, what we see also the survey by Ipsos Mori and Fashion Revolution, that 80% of consumers want brands to declare sustainable and transparent supply chains. Now that's academic research, but what you see on the right-hand side is the market evidence that several brands who have built a very strong sustainability and transparency as core values have done pretty well more recently, but also over longer term, like Patagonia, Ellen Fisher, but also fast emerging brands. When you look at Allbirds, you look at Everlane, Armed Angels in Germany. Several of them have built very, very strong differentiation around sustainability and transparency. Of course, they have to make sure the product has a strong performance element, like in Patagonia, or has a strong comfort and aesthetics element, like what you see in Allbirds. But they have built a very strong differentiation that you see around sustainability and transparency. So essentially, if I then have to summarize, our let's say key takeaways so far, I would say there are 5 key levers if you want to engage your top management around why traceability investment helps to actually recover what they have already invested around sustainability. First, it helps strengthen the brand reputation. It really secures the reputation around supply chain compliance risks, around unauthentic claims, and it also helps in the brand reputation because there's a very strong pull from consumers around having transparent supply chains. Second, Ivan, is the aspect around help on basically it helps deliver on corporate sustainability goals, which several of the brands, as we discussed earlier, have made 100% sustainable fibers commitment. And once you have a very strong traceability backbone, we believe it would also help create more traceability and transparency around a reliable and accurate greenhouse gas impact or water impact around scope 3 of the garment supply chain. So there's secondary benefit that comes once you have a very strong traceability backbone. You cannot do a meaningful scope 3 greenhouse gas impact or water impact if you do not know which country is spinning happening, or which country is knitting or weaving happening or dyeing happening. Now, if you move on to then the third key benefit is around lower compliance cost. So there's both an element of top line with the brand reputation, what we discussed earlier, but also the bottom line in terms of helping reducing the cost itself, because it eliminates the need for a lot of offline spreadsheets and PDF documents that are flying around in the system that you know quite well. It helps to reduce the compliance effort that's needed across the supply chain. So not only you benefit, but essentially the entire supply chain benefits because of a lower level of compliance effort needed. And then the fourth key lever is around, of course, deeper consumer engagement, right? Several brands we have seen, like what we saw in case of Everlane. We also know that H&M also reveals a transparency layer in the shopping experience. So it could really enrich the shopping experience online or offline at shops to drive deeper engagement at the level of consumer. And what we see in post-COVID-19, sorry, the type it's COVID-19, consumers are even more sustainability conscious in their buying decisions, which is what we see in some of the recent market research surveys coming out. And finally, one of the key factors that we see is investors are increasingly driven by ESG, environmental, social, and governance performance of companies, and also in the fashion industry. And that has become a key selection metric for investors, and increasingly more, again, after COVID-19 with the climate change, investors want to make sure that actually your company is built around principles that doesn't, has unseen or unforeseen risks in the supply chain. And if you have a very strong traceability layer of transparency, then a lot of those risks can be eliminated. So with that, I would like to pass on to Yvonne.
Thank you, Amit. So creating a sustainable and traceable supply chain, which leads on very nicely to the role of sustainability standards. So let's start off with a little bit of recap. In the last webinar, we talked a little bit about how information flow in the supply chain is distinctly different and separate from how the tracking of material changes form and how that material is processed along the supply chain. And for a sustainable material to be credibly traced, all three elements, the information flow, the physical material, and the physical process needs to have a certain degree of integrity and credibility. And that's where the role of sustainability standard kicks in. Amit started today's discussion talking about the difference between transparency, traceability, and chain of custody. Traceability being the ability to verify the history, location, or application of a particular material by means of documented recorded identification, and chain of custody being the custodial sequence or the change of material legal ownership from one party to the next. So in very, very simple words, traceability is really the ability to demonstrate the chain of custody within the supply chain itself. It is important to really understand this because the degree of traceability is highly dependent, therefore, on the level of specificity defined by the chain of custody itself. You simply cannot achieve traceability at a granular site-to-site level if the chain of custody is scoped at a broader level. And to that end, transparency can really only be achieved to the extent where the material itself can be traced, although often case it is less due to the other factors like data confidentiality and fair competition. So on that note, and with that in mind, let's look at some of the chain of custody models. So different chain of custody models have different levels of ambition, and yes, to that extent, different costs and resource requirements. So let's start with identity preserved. The identity preserved model ensures that the certified and non-certified material in a certified site is separately stored and tracked from the other resources. So, you know, they simply cannot be mixed. So if used throughout the supply chain, meaning that every single tier of the supply chain also follows this identity preserved model, it enables a certified material to be uniquely traced from source to finished product. But this can often case be quite cost and resource intensive because each lot and each batch or each consignment of the certified material needs to be handled and managed separately. Then we have segregated. The segregated model ensures the separation in the same way as identity preserved of certified and non-certified material at each stage of the supply chain also. But the distinct difference is that it permits the mixing of certified materials to the same standard from different sources at the very beginning. So the important point is that this can happen at the start of the supply chain at source, and it does need to be compliant to the same standard. So whilst there is assurance that the material originates from certified sources or a set number of specific origin, it does not allow the identification to a specific origin, a specific point of origin. The next is mass balance. In the mass balance model, the volume of certified material entering the supply chain is reconciled with an equivalent amount of volume of certified material leaving the supply chain. So X plus Y must equal, that comes out of the supply chain in what is shown on the screen here, must equal to X and Y that enters the supply chain in the first place. So within the supply chain itself, mixing of certified and non-certified material is allowed. So in this specific case, whilst there is assurance in the volume of certified material that is used, was produced in the first place at the point of origin, there is no assurance that the material used in the final product is certified. And lastly, there is the credit trading model, sometimes also called book and claim or certificate trading. In this model, the certified and non-certified material is mixed throughout the supply chain. It is not managed, reconciled, or tracked. Credit or certificate sometimes is issued at the start of the supply chain and can be bought and sold by different players. It is intended to reward the responsible production at the source, and the claim for this particular production is completely decoupled from the final product itself. So in this slide, we look at, you know, the different examples of standards that operates in these different models. It is not limited to these, but these are just some examples that we've put together. In identity preserved, we have cotton made in Africa. We have fair trade, we use this flow cert. In the segregated model, textile exchanges, all of textile exchanges standards, from, you know, OCS to the recycled standards, RCS, GRS, and the animal welfare standards, RDS, RWS, and RMS, they all follow the segregated model. And then we have mass balance. BCI is quite a commonly known model in the mass balance area. And cotton made in Africa also uses mass balance as well. So in certain cases, one standard may adopt more than one particular type of chain of custody model. In credit trading, there is the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, RSPO, the UTZ, Label and Program for Sustainable Farming, and the Leather Impact Accelerator, which is under development by Textile Exchange. Although the Leather Impact Accelerator isn't a standard per se, it is a program. But it does work with credit trading to enable sort of the sustainable production. So Amit also spoke about forensic audits or forensic authentication. And there are a number of forensic authentication solutions out there. In fact, there are quite many now. Generally speaking, we can kind of categorize them into the following four broad categories. There are DNA markers, whereby the solution provider will insert a DNA molecule structure inside the product itself. It's an in-product forensic authentication method. This can sometimes be provided by a third party or in certain cases by the supplier themselves. We have natural fingerprinting. In those cases, they use isotope or trace elements derived from the natural chemical composition of the plants and animals. The third category is using microscopic dust. In typical case, you're looking at the microbiome or the genetic material of the microbes themselves that coats the product. So this is more sort of an on-product traceability rather than an in-product traceability. And then the fourth category is really synthetic markers. And there are quite a number of them out there. Dyes, inks, fluorescent markers that are applied on the product itself. So the last slide, I really want to talk about how chain of custody and these forensic authentication technologies fits together. In conclusion, really chain of custody and forensic audits, they play a complementary role in the credible traceability within the supply chain itself. Chain of custody ensures the sustainability credential of a certified material across the supply chain. Specifically, it looks at site verification to ensure that an auditor goes in to make sure that that particular site is adhering to basic sustainability performance. In certain cases, it may be social, sometimes it's chemical, that the materials are properly segregated and stored and tracked properly. In terms of process verification, it ensures that the way that the material is produced, the product is produced, is compliant to the industry standard or the standard dictated by the requirements required by the standards themselves. And the chain of custody framework provides sort of an overall visibility of information across the different supply chain tiers. So when fed information from the forensic audit, this allows sort of a risk-based verification of textile products instead of a pure random sample. If we're looking at forensic audit, typically it's not used for every single material and product that is produced within the chain. It's typically used sort of either within one tier or a certain batch due to the cost factor. When worked with a chain of custody, which typically looks at the entire production, you can derive a more risk-based assessment and verification of the particular product. And overall, what this allows us to do is to, going back to what Amit said earlier, is an assessment of outcome and impact, specifically around in relation to carbon or energy. And that really is quite in line with Textile Exchange's Climate Plus strategy, to try to reduce the climate impact by sort of 45% in the next years to come. So on the forensic audit side, it really does complement the chain of custody because the physical testing allows authentication of the presence of a certified material in the product itself. it adds this additional layer of validation. And in certain cases, when you marry the information that comes out of a forensic audit into the chain of custody, and you can collaborate and complement that information, you can also reduce the redundancy of information input within the supply chain or the traceability platform in itself. This complements, the first slide that I was talking about by connecting the material flow or the site level information to the overall information flow that is carried through the chain of custody. And as mentioned in previous slides, there are many emerging technologies in this space, and it opens a lot of opportunities for us to leverage these two sort of technology pieces together. So and this is really sort of, this complementary role is really a vision or a direction that Textile Exchange is striving towards. So on this note, this takes us to the end of the presentation. Before we break for Q&A, I just want to quickly remind the last webinar, which is on September the 2nd, which talks about Textile Exchange and Textile Genesis collaboration in this space to really take this, what we have spoken about earlier, both in blockchain, in transparency, and also the forensic authentication, and our findings in our collaboration pilot. So on this note, I will break for Q&A. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A chat box. I'm going to try to open.
Yeah. So I think the first question, Yvonne, is for me, from Sabrina Hartman. Hi, to what kind of certification are you referring to on slide 7? You refer to, for example, fair trade or brand's own certificate. So in this case, we are referring to both the scope certificates and also the transaction related certificates, which are the standards that Yvonne talked about in terms of segregation or identity preservation. So that's one type, scope and transaction. And second is the product level certificates, where you have differentiated fibers from lensing, for example, Tencel Ecovero, or from Unify, you have Reprieve. There are also certificates related to those products as well, where the players themselves are verifying forensically whether the fiber exists in the textile product or not, and then issue a certificate for that article. And what you see now is all of those, be it those scope certificates or transaction, or fabric level certificates based on forensic verification, all has to be tracked independently, and they are not directly on a common backbone. What we're trying to do and look at together is first of all, how do we look at what Yvonne also mentioned last time as a digital chain of custody to simplify some of those challenges that we see now. Yeah, Yvonne, next question is for you.
Amit, I'm going to need your help here. My Q&A chat box is not showing, so I can't see the questions. If you don't mind reading them out, that would be very helpful.
Yes. So hi, Yvonne. So forensics don't apply to the mass balance and credit models of chain of custody, right? Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Applied to mass balance, yeah, that would be difficult because within the supply chain itself, the non-certified and the certified material is mixed. So in the mass balance, you can't apply it to the particular product. You're right. It would naturally apply more to the identity preserved or the segregated model.
Yeah, so then we have anonymous attendee. Thank you for inspiring presentation. Is it possible to listen it again? Are you planning to post it on your website? Thank you. So Yvonne, as far as I understand, they will be posted on the YouTube, right? On the Textile Exchange channel.
Yes, and just for all registered participants, whether you've been able to attend today or not, but if you've registered for this webinar, you'll be sent an email with links to the presentation as well as the video.
Oh, great. Thanks, Rose. Yeah. Then we have next question is from Mark. Prior collaboration and standards will certainly be key to broad adoption and overall textile industry efficiency and integrity. We look forward to working more closely with Textile Exchange and others as the seam advances the US Cotton Trust Protocol with advanced technologies that support your presentation. So I think it's more of a comment than a question. But
Yeah.
thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, Textile Exchange is launching or has launched the Climate Plus strategy, and part of our strategy to achieve that, we understand it is not something that we can achieve ourselves. And a lot of work that we're doing across our different platforms, our technology and standards pieces together, and also within the fiber materials platform, in our PFM matrix and the copper fiber material program, in sum, really does look towards the industry players and different stakeholders, and how we can collaborate together. So in order to achieve this, and harmonization, alignment, collaboration, these are huge keywords for us. So yeah, we do look forward to being able to collaborate with every one of them. Thank you.
And we have another question coming in. I'm just looking at it now. 1 second. So, so Jeff, yeah, that's done. Lisa Lonso, can you clarify whether you can have transparency before you have traceability? As I thought you needed transparency before you can have the data to support traceability. Yeah. So, I mean, you're right in terms of transparency into the supply chain, that one has to have transparency into the supply chain to create traceability. But what we were referring to transparency, which is used more towards the sharing of traceability data with the different players in the ecosystem, or what is often called also transparency layer, where a brand would look at their traceability data and actually create, select what kind of transparency parameters they want to share with consumers. If it's more compliance related data, which is not relevant for consumers, but relevant for suppliers, or even their internal stakeholders, then they would actually bring that traceability data into the transparency layer or the visibility layer within the company. So that's what we refer to transparency is. Once you have the traceability, it's about sharing externally that traceability data and being more transparent with your stakeholders, be it employees or consumers or suppliers or investors. And what you're referring to is actually knowing the supply chain before you create traceability. So yes, I agree with your statement. You have to have that to create traceability.
And I mean, just to add on to that topic of discussion as well, as I mentioned before, having a transparent supply chain, there are also a lot of additional factors that one has to consider, data confidentiality, for example, fair competition within, as a standard owner, in often case, we cannot simply just say, make all your data visible and available. There must be certain, mechanisms to ensure that, the interest of each particular stakeholder is protected. And, on top of that, there should also be incentives, right? When we ask for more data, it is more work. So we also have to ensure that there is, a certain degree of incentive for them to willingly and happily disclose that information. Because that information adds a lot more value to the supply chain and the credibility of the traceability of that particular material itself.
Okay, no, thanks, Yvonne, fully agree. Then we have a question from anonymous attendee. How is traceability guaranteed when aggregation events happen as part of the supply chain and manufacturing of raw materials? Is it purely by physical separation of materials? Do materials get lot and batch assigned or serialized to be able to be tracked more effectively when these events happen? So I would say yes, the materials have a lot and batch number assigned to it. Also, individual articles have their article ID or article number, be it the fabric article or garment ID, along with the lot becomes the way you, you know, take into account the aggregation or disaggregation of the products as they move along the supply chain. So physical separation works well in the differentiated fibers, not in all. And later on, it becomes more important to have the lot and the serial number. Next question, Yvonne, for you. Yes, tell me.
Yeah, just to add to that as well, within the different standards, typically would happen within a chain of custody. You look at the change in ownership, and that's where the input and output is volume reconciled. So whatever you purchase in, it's kind of like a bank balance. It has to match what you're selling. And within that input and output reconciliation at each level of the change of ownership, if you will, that is reconciled. And within that, we also take into consideration the wastage factor that occurs within the processing of a particular material.
Yeah, great. Next question from Kuldeep, Yvonne, for you. Hi, Yvonne. Can we expect any traceability platform from Textile Exchange in future so that brands can use for their tracking the sustainable supply chain?
Yes, the short answer is yes. We are working at sort of two levels really. One is our existing transaction certificates and our scope certificates. You know, how we are existingly using our chain of custody. And we're developing a traceability platform called the Track It system. And that is in progress right now, and we're hoping to be able to release that. The other area that we are exploring with Textile Genesis, and that will be covered in the next webinar, is an assessment of how we can leverage new technologies, such as those that we've described today, as well as the blockchain technology that I've described in the last webinar, to completely digitalize the chain of custody of our standards. We're doing an assessment right now through the pilots, and you know, we'll come up with the findings that will be fed into the chain of custody revision, the content claim standard revision, which underwrites all our standards, and provided that that goes through the international working group, then it is something that we can will also take forward. So within that kind of framework, it is not intended to replace, but offered as an alternative. So instead of having maybe a transaction certificate, we could possibly look forward to systemizing the information flow from a site directly to the digital platform, and tracing the digital footprint instead of a certificate itself.
No, great. Thanks, Yvonne. Then the next question is, how do forensic audits help or not help assure the sustainability of blended products where more than one type of fiber is used? For example, sustainable cotton, like BCI cotton mixed with recycled polyester.
So in the case of BCI, BCI is a mass balance model. So as I mentioned before, it will be difficult to trace because the composition of the certified material, you don't know whether even if there is any or what percentage of that particular certified material is in the final product. So that's not going to really work in a mass balance model. But in a segregated or an identity preserved model, it will provide that additional level of sort of credibility by authenticating that that particular product itself has a X% of a certified material. Now, different solution providers, you know, as I mentioned, there are a lot of forensic sort of authentication solution providers out there, and different solution providers will have different capabilities, but you know, the technologies are available out there whereby if you insert some signature markers or whatnot, then you can derive to a certain degree of accuracy the blend ratio. So let's say if it's 50% certified organic cotton versus 50% conventional cotton, then you can actually determine to a degree of accuracy that that composition exists within the final product. But again, it does depend on the marker itself.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think we know that also in some of the you know, premium sustainable fibers, when you look at Tencel or Ecovero or Reprieve, then you can, it can help you in the blend ratio verification as well to a certain level of accuracy. You will never be plus minus, not be very accurate, but I think with maybe plus minus 10% accuracy, you should be able to have a good understanding of the blend ratio as well. Okay. Next question. We have a factory in Bangladesh for reprocessing PET bottles to fibers. We applied for 2 certificates of GRS to Control Union and CCPB unknowingly. We were issued both certificates but have not used any of those certificates till date. We have been banned for 2 years. Please suggest what to do next, because they unknowingly applied for 2 certificates of GRS with 2 different certification bodies.
Okay, thank you for your question. Can I suggest that you write an email to assurance@textileexchange.org? This is a specific assurance question, so I'm not in a position to advise you, and also we will need a little bit more information. If you can write to assurance@textileexchange.org and provide a level of information, then we will follow up on this.
Okay, then how and who will bring the supply chain data on the materials to the end consumers? Maybe you go first and then I might build on it.
Yeah, so I mean, the idea really is that the Textile Exchange as a standard on its own, we won't be connecting directly to the end consumer. What we are hoping to do is to you know, have the information available so that the brands themselves can take this to the consumer. On an aggregate level, however, it is something that, you know, we are increasingly focusing on to provide more aggregate information through either our reports or our communication channel, either our hub, you know, to connect and inform the consumers themselves on sort of aggregate impacts or, you know, outcomes across the supply chain and taking this information to the consumer. But on a specific product to product level, it is not within sort of our purview to do. It is something that we're wishing to sort of inform the a brand so that they have this information to tell the stories to the consumers.
Right. So I think I agree. I think there's also in some cases it also depends quite a bit on the brand itself to make that decision, is what we have seen. And it works pretty well in the online model because they can you know, they know the part of the portfolio which is transparent. In the offline model, it becomes more complex because if only 10% of your products are traceable, you cannot tell a consumer you can scan that particular garment article and cannot scan something else in the retail store. Whereas in the online, it's much easier to share the data when someone is browsing that product which has the data. Only then you show the data, otherwise you don't. Okay, I think this next comment is from the same company, Yvonne, where you suggested to right to assurance. So I would then move on to the next one. But essentially, the gentleman was saying they've made a lot of investments, so therefore, please help them in addressing that challenge. And finally, I think we have the last question now. How can one organization apply for 2 GRS if they're headed by Textile Exchange? Please give proper guidance in this matter for future applications. Or again, same question from the same, I think same gentleman or the lady.
Again, I will take this up offline if you could, and I'm happy to take this up personally as well if you want to copy myself into it. My email address is yvonne@textileexchange.org, and I'll make sure that it is followed up. The certification is issued by the certification body, so we will follow up with the certification body on how that happens.
No, great. So we have no more questions. So Yvonne, back to you and Rose.
Okay, so we seem to have one more, although I can't click on it.
Oh, yes, yes. Can you help on technology for recycled garments as well, or do you only help with certifications? Reshma Nath.
I don't quite understand that question. Amit, do you? Or maybe you can provide
I think,
a little more insight.
Yeah, maybe, I think this probably is not that relevant, Reshma, for Textile Exchange, because they are more into the standards and not into technology solution provider. So the question was, do you also help in the technology for garment recycling?
Oh, I see. Myself, I don't have a lot of knowledge on the recycling technology, but it is, if you can, again, send an email, you can address that email to me. I will connect with the subject matter expert, and they can perhaps get back to you on that.
Right. And I think then the question is from Ritesh Agarwal. We would like to start a genuine organic cotton project in India. How to go about it? And Amish has replied, check PFMR 2020. I'm not sure if it's a response to that question. But again, I would say, Ritesh, please contact Yvonne if you would like to start a cotton project, and then she could help you, guide you.
Yeah.
Okay. No, great. I think then, Amish is just saying the PFMR 2020 for recycling information for this technology recycling question that came up.
Okay, I think we can probably answer one more if there is. I can only see a red mark.
I think Reshma is just asking for your email address.
All right, it's evonne@textileexchange.org. So, okay, on that note, thank you everybody for attending today's webinar. As Rose mentioned, we will send out the recordings. And Rose, do you have any last words before we close the session?
No, thank you to our speakers, and thank you for participating in today's webinar. And as Yvonne reminded you, we will be sending out a link to the presentation to all registered participants. And that concludes our webinar for today. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, everybody. Have a nice day.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks. Bye.